In Chattanooga, Tennessee, David Tulis.
What does Bowtie say today? Well, this is David Tulis with Nooga Radio, live on your smartphone, your smart device through the TuneIn Radio app, and also on Facebook Live at Nooga Radio. On YouTube, it's Hot News Talk Radio. If 99.7% of immigrants in the United States are legal, why are we so eager for a war against them, a new restraints against them with the approval of people like you, with the applause of conservatives, as they're called, with the applause of Republicans who pretend to care about liberty, who pretend that they are all about preserving the family, preserving small business, preserving American agriculture and the small farm, and constitutional liberties. But no, that is not what we have in the whole uproar over immigration. And you might say the narrative, right? Whether false or true, I'll let you decide. The narrative about the invasion of dark-skinned, hardworking people, many of them pro-life, many of them Catholics or practicing Christians, many of them hardworking, many of them seeking to flee lawless districts in Mexico. Here, willing to work hard, willing to invest time in their employers' businesses, willing to even work in the gray market, the free market. Unlike many of us who will not work in the free market, we insist on having withholding and so on. 99% of all people who successfully enter the U.S. do so legally, whether as tourists, guest workers, or refugees. This vast majority has been legal from 2003 through 2015. Merely 0.3% of all entries in that time frame were legal. Got that? 0.3%. In other words, 0.3% of 1%. The last year for which data is available, 2015, provides evidence that illegal entries are falling, as 99.81% of all admissions were legal, while only 0.19% were illegal. So it peaked in 2004. The peak illegal entry was 0.42%. In other words, 0.4% of 1%. Call, you're live on the air. David Tulis, what's on your mind? Thanks for calling.
Love you, David, but I have to throw down the BS flag. I mean, come on. That statistic is a made-up statistic. I've dealt with statistics for many years, and you can make it look like anything you want. I saw where you got the statistic from. It's a Barack Obama leftover. It favors liberals and Democrats, and that's just a lie. You can't believe. So all of a sudden now we're believing what government puts out in pamphlets.
Well, this is the Department of Homeland Security. Go ahead.
I mean, we can argue that it's okay to just come into the country illegally, to just walk through and get all the benefits and whatever. Just take them, just walk into my house and grab whatever you want, walk into David
Tulis' that's a false
house
analogy.
And grab whatever you want, because we don't have a right to protect your property borders. But that's a different argument than quoting a government lie out of a government book under a corrupt Obama administration. You can't believe anything that came out of that administration for 8 years. Erase it. Even if you like it, erase it, because it was a lie. You make the argument without taking an Obama administration lie. But okay, thanks.
Okay, well, Mike, thanks very much. The number, by the way, is 800-8949. If you, my caller, want to interrupt me, please do. Okay, I like getting my work done, which is what I have to argue here in defense of free markets and local economy at Nooga Radio. I love making this case, but your call, my listeners' call at 800-8949. That's 800-8949 is always welcome, and please don't hesitate to interrupt me. And I do put it that way because that is how I view this show is where my work is done on your behalf, giving you a free market, a consistent classical liberal analysis, hopefully a Christocentric also analysis of the way the world works, with often references to biblical precepts that I hold as true, as Roy Moore does. Of course, Roy Moore being a man of stature, and I'm just your slow man in Chattanooga, the slow man who asks the dumb questions. This is picked up in FEE.org, the Foundation for Economic Education, And it says that in 2015, about 5 out of every 100. Now, this is an interesting figure considering imprisonment. Okay, Americans are much more likely to be caught up in conflict with the law than immigrants. And here's how: 5 out of every 100,000 foreigners entered into the U.S. illegally in that year, 2015. 5 out of every 100,000 came in illegally, so that means 99.995% did not. In the same year, 189 out of every 100,000 Americans entered jail or prison, which means that 99.8% did not. The annual flow of Americans into prisons would drop by 97.4% from roughly 608,300 to about 16,000 if Americans were as respectful of criminal laws as foreigners are of our immigration laws. If that happened, then federal and state prisons would mostly empty out in about 3 years. So hear about that. That's if Americans honored the so-called laws in this country at the same rate that immigrants honored the immigration statutes, we'd be out of prison, would be hardly any need for prisons in the future. These points are made by a writer named Alex Nowrasteh at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. And Roy Moore holds to the Trump analysis of the surfeit of dark-skinned people in Tennessee, right, and elsewhere. I don't, because I believe in liberty. And let me ask you this. If you think that oppressing visitors, oppressing aliens and strangers, people who speak other languages, oppressing them in their flight here, they came here at great risk to themselves, at great peril, great expense, leaving everything behind. That's something that Christianity, well, actually the children of Israel taught the world. If you believe Thomas Cahill's great book on how the Israelites changed, how the so-called Jews, they were Israelites, and they're called Jews today, those people who claim descendants in the Israelites. What the Jews brought to the world, effectively, is what Cahill's title is in his book. And they revolutionized the way the world thinks about everything, the way the world sees. It was trained by God in his continuing revelation of himself in humankind. We need to have respect for all people and reverence for their rights. We should respect their right to move. We should respect the right of people to move in free labor and uphold the concept of a free market in labor. And let me ask you this. If you think that immigrants are going to be abused only, and we'll let DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, abuse them, do you think that we're going to escape that? Do you really think that? Let me just ask you if you want to believe it. Now, I mentioned that because there's a story by Matt Novak in Gizmodo, a story picked up first by BuzzFeed News about the Federal Register, and the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is going to be collecting information about immigrants' Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts. But the document mentions also that somehow it's going to try to gather search results. So, even if you're at duckduckgo.com, which has a no tracing of URLs that come to its website for searches, even there, maybe somehow the government will, or at least maybe in this proposal, is reserving the right to somehow, once it gets technologically adept, that it will, even at duckduckgo.com, get your search results. According to the announcement that of this proceedings against immigrants, right? Not just people who are future immigrant applicants, right? But people who are already here. They now face search and seizure of online accounts, social media handles, aliases, associated identifiable information, and search results. They're going after the immigrants, and they're not going to go after you. No, they will not go after you at all. This is David Tulis. What's on your mind, caller?
By going to your ISP with a simple NDA. They've been doing it for years. That's all. Bye.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I didn't. You might listen, couldn't hear everything the caller said, but he's pointing out that because the NSA has access to your ISP or your internet service provider, it doesn't matter what search engine you use. your searches are traced that way. So DuckDuckGo, as I was suggesting, doesn't matter. It does not offer you any more security from surveillance than if you use Google or other platforms. Sorry, I didn't push the button for you to hear that caller's full comment. The term information sharing agreements isn't defined in the policy, but it could conceivably cover both the types of surveillance agreements that the U.S. has with countries such as the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand under the Five Eyes, as well as the agreements that DHS has with companies such as Google and internet service providers. So the question is, and I would ask this of Roy Moore, do you really want to subject immigrants, all immigrants now, to this kind of treatment? And I would say it's not just treatment. It is an abuse. It is an abuse of the idea that the law should be fair to all, that there should not be one law for the alien as in the old Hebrew Republic. There should not be one law for the alien and one law for the Israelite. No, in that law, everybody was treated the same. The poor were not treated with special deference by the courts, nor the rich. That's what God requires. That's what the Ten Commandments, which are a summary of the law of God. That's what they require. Implicit in the Ten Commandments, of course, is the idea of equity, and not equality, equity, and justice. In that law, there's no favor for the rich, there's no favor for the poor, and the murderer and the rapist and the others worthy of death, where there is mens rea, where there's the guilty mind, where there's intent, those people face capital punishment, and everybody else, jail and prison. No, there's no jail and there's no prison in the Christian theory, right? In the Christian social theory. Christian social theory does exist, and what we have to do is, as I'm suggesting, more and more Americans want godly government. And in Alabama, the more people won, their candidate won, because he unabashedly and unapologetically rejects the humanistic perspective that says law is local. You know, that's what ancient empires had. They had a local law. The law was the will and the word of the local tyrant. His wishes were law. Of course, they were changing. They weren't written. You couldn't really make appeal into that law if you were abused or offended. It was not a stable system. And modern people who reject God, especially modern Christians who reject God's law, they are accepting the alternative. There is no middle ground. There is no neutral ground. Your minister should be telling you it's either God's law or man's law. There's much been said in the past few days about disrespecting the American flag, and kneeling, and, taking the knee has become a kind of expression in the past week. Taking the knee has become suddenly common parlance, and it will fade as something stale in a couple months. But I'd say that that whole Colin Kaepernick matter came on the point of police abuse. It came because officers in Chattanooga didn't read carefully the code of ethics that requires the officer to uphold the Constitution. That is something that is noteworthy. I'll be posting something about that at Nooganomics.com shortly. That is, of course, the website for the Man Who Matters, our chief sponsor here at the David Tulis Show, Nooganomics.com. And it talks about a somewhat detailed discussion about how the officer is to uphold the Constitution and respect the liberty of the people. It's quite explicit. And I would say, forbids MF and other common usages among police ranks, FK, SH, GD, and so on. There all kinds of words are forbidden because there is a requirement that the law will be enforced courteously and appropriately without fear or favor, malice, or ill will. All of those terms imply malice. And it is against abuses of that rule, that ethic rule here in the Chattanooga Police Department, and that kind of rule elsewhere, that sparked this protest, the kneeling protest. And so it's not really against the flag, it's not really against American ways in general. It's against that. That's what Colin Kaepernick was objecting to. And I think you should respect that. I think there's something to be heard in his initial argument, which has since been drowned out. The things that are more disrespectful than the American flag, as we make note of on our Facebook page here at Nooga Radio, would be, for example, secret FISA courts, the government's support of ISIS in Syria, laws that infringe on the Second Amendment, targeting political opposition with the IRS. Think of Mark West's abuse 3 or 4 years ago at the hands of Lois Lerner's henchmen. targeting your political opposition with the IRS, prosecuting people who expose government crimes as traitors. These are far more important than disrespecting the flag. Why are people talking about that flag anyway? Who cares? Sending America's youth to fight in preemptive and unconstitutional wars of aggression that never end. How is that? Is that not much more worth opposing? Free speech zones, career politicians, a powerful central government, killing family pets during no-knock raids at the wrong address, shooting unarmed citizens who are having a mental health crisis, bailing out bankers, taking money from poor people in America and using it to prop up rich dictators while calling it foreign aid, and mandating that people must purchase a product they don't want or face penalties.
8949. I think that's your number. 800-8949.
Yeah, 800-8949. Got it.
Listen, I promise I won't call again, but I'm going to throw the BS flag down at you again. Kaepernick is a communist. He reveres Cuba's Fidel Castro, who was a murderer. Okay, he's a Marxist communist. He hates this country.
Pig, right?
What's the next thing? They're going to burn the flag? The issue, David, is can workers, while they're working, the NFL is a franchise, disrespect what the governing documents of the franchise is?
The answer is
no. No,
I agree. They can't.
You can't walk in the subway and take a knee. You can't be on this radio station, I'm sure, and just do whatever you want. There's a procedure. And nor can the NFL rebuke what the franchise calls for, and that's what they're doing. These are a bunch of slobs, the disrespectful pigs. How far are they going to go on their job? They hate America. They want white privilege. Oh, you're white and you're proud. I'm proud to be white. I'm not apologizing for it. Thank God for it. If it wasn't for white Europeans in America, blacks would still be in chains. They should be thanking white America that they're free. Thank you, white America, for freeing us. Because slavery was all over the world. There were more black slave owners than whites, and blacks were selling blacks into servitude. Thank you, white people. Enough of the excuses, black community. Get off your asses, go to work, and shut up.
That sounds like a very final statement. Mike, I really appreciate it. Thank you for calling me. My knowledge about Colin Kaepernick is nil. I must say I don't know anything about him. But that was his initial reason. Whether or not he was lawfully acting according to his contracted arrangements with his league is a question I'm not going to address. But the grievance that he had is legitimate. His method perhaps is beyond his authorization in his contract. So I see that point, and I wasn't meaning to urge that the listener not respect the obligation that he made with his owners in that relationship. To adhere to that owner's rules of conduct. That is, of course, a valid claim upon him. And if he was not allowed to make a political statement as a player on company time, then he should have honored that. Well, this is David Tulis, and I want to just mention why I think there's something exciting to consider, and that is Roy Moore. Roy Moore is a national figure. And he is been explicit in his defense of constitutional government and God's role in it. He said in his speech yesterday, he said, "I believe we can make America great, but we must make America good, and you cannot make America good without acknowledging the sovereign source of that goodness." So you notice the word sovereignty. The sovereign, my notes are not clear. Something is a law of liberty and government, which is Almighty God. We have become a nation that has separated from the very foundations of law. Washington said all the dispositions and habits that lead to political peace and prosperity, of all those, religion and morality are indispensable supports. We are one nation under God, and we have become disunified. And then he cited melees, mobs, riots, and protests. He said we are created in the image of God, quoting Harry Truman as saying people are created in the image of God from that faith, and from that faith we will not be moved. And Roy Moore says we have been moved. We have been moved. And the source of the problem, let me say, the biblical analysis is that the Christian people are the source of the problem, right? And that is the church that has rejected the Ten Commandments, and that is most of the evangelical American church. That is why the American church is so weak. It is so even though it has many things that it believes are true, it has lost its calling, and its calling is not just to bolster and encourage the individual. It is to bolster and encourage the culture, the state. And as you know, I'm looking for a minister who has given a sermon in the past 10 years about the idea of prisons. Are prisons lawful before God? Does God ordain prisons? Does he require them? Or are they ungodly and anti-Christian? I say they're anti-Christian based on Old Testament statutes on how a wrongdoer is to be handled by the court, under the supervision of the court. Making right. The whole theme in the Bible is victims' rights. The modern system of humanitarianism and humanism disregards the victim entirely. And the state is the offended party in every criminal matter, even though the state has cannot have standing to show injury. And that's a point that Jay Hirsch made in his appeal, a remarkable appeal in Nashville, about which you can read only at Nooganomics.com. Nooganomics.com. That is the website that covers the deep state in Tennessee. And he makes the argument that the state has no standing to claim injury. It just doesn't have standing. So what has to happen is the state has to represent the victim. It has to care about the victim and not pretend its own self to be injured, say in a murder, a robbery, or some other crime like a rape. It's not the state that's the victim, it's the victim. And so what has to happen is the state has to mediate, if not the death penalty for a capital offense, it has to mediate restoration and compensation for the victim. That's what the court does. It arranges for restitution, and that's it. There is no prison system. So because Christians reject the commandments, because Christians reject God's government, they effectively reject Roy Moore. And yet in Alabama, Christian people love Roy Moore, and somehow they're not being consistent here. But that's good. That's good. Let them not be consistent. Let him, in his public pronouncements, say we have to move back to God. God can bring us back, is what he said yesterday. He defended the Constitution all his life as a soldier in Vietnam, as a military policeman, and he's defended it before innumerable liberal judges, and he will defend it in the Yankee Senate as well. And the question, I guess, for my listener, you're not a practicing Christian. I understand that. You may know Christian people, but the question you have to ask Christian people is this: do you really believe in the law of God, or do you believe in grace? As if somehow there is a conflict between grace and the law of God. There isn't. There is simply no conflict. There is no contradiction. You can't say because we live under grace that we have no law. There's always been grace. Moses was the object of grace. Abraham was the object of grace. Just read about it in Hebrews. The whole story, tracing all the fathers who were men of faith. Right? They were all men of faith. Adam, the first of them. Noah. Abraham, Moses, and all the others. They were all men of faith, all saved by grace. They were all saved by grace. And they were given a world-changing policy. And that policy, that claim, that promise, that law was in the Scriptures. And that's God's connection with man, God's revelation to man. And because we have Christian people who reject God, reject God's law, we look at Roy Moore startled. He startles us and shocks us. And we know he's right. We know what he says about the Ten Commandments, what he says about God's law. He's right. And so I think what has to happen in the Christian world is that the Christian people need to start reading books by Gary North, let's say. I'm reading Victims' Rights right now, and we'll probably peek into his other book, Tools of Dominion, probably the largest theological book ever, a massive, wonderful, wonderful book, which I need to give some time. This is David Tulis. Can we have Christian rebuilding and reconstruction? Maybe.
Traffic, news, and information. Nooga Radio, Digital FM 95.3 HD4, and